Okay, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the key legal issues that startups face, let's say, in the first 6 months or even up to the first 2 years of the entity's life. So let's say you've set up a startup, or you're just quitting your job, you want to start up a new company. These are some of the key legal things you'll need to do to set up properly. There are a lot of services out there, online services, where you could set up, but you need to be aware of what are you doing. A startup is not the same thing as a small business, so you need to set it up properly so later on you're not going to find additional issues. So the first thing is corporate matters. I've separated these matters into different categories, but corporate is the first thing usually, because you usually figure out a business structure and where you're going to set up and what it would look like, whether it would be a C Corp versus an LLC versus an S Corp. Most startups will set up as a C Corp, and then you find the appropriate jurisdiction, whether it's going to be New York or Delaware. And once you determine that and you do your filing, you have to worry about your stock. You have to authorize stock. Most startups will authorize enough shares so they can give it to founders, and also set aside some for an incentive plan to attract talent. In most cases, for example, you might authorize 10 million shares and then issue let's say half of that initially, make an allocation for an incentive plan. I'll go into that in a little bit, but make sure that you set up the company properly. You file it with appropriate authority, whichever state you're set up in. If you set up, for example, if you decide instead of New York you want to set up in Delaware, you still need to, for example, if you're based in New York, you still need to worry about doing a foreign qualification in New York, because you're still doing business in New York. You just are a Delaware company doing business, so you need to file a foreign qualification. With stock, one of the big issues that I see is that people have issued stock too soon to a founder who's not going to perform. So you need to make sure that there are repurchase rights if the founder doesn't perform, and how long do you need to test out the founder. So, for example, you might have heard of the term cliff period, or you might have heard of vesting schedule. Usually you can set up a long cliff period, let's say up to 12 months, with a 4-year vesting schedule, so they earn their equity over a long period of time. So, for example, if things don't work out by month 11, you can repurchase the stock, and then that way you haven't handed out equity to a founder who hasn't performed. On the commercial side, so let's say if you're in a technology business and you have a SaaS product, you have different stakeholders, right? You may have multiple users, or let's say you have a single category of users who are going to use that SaaS product. You may, for example, also have free model and then enterprise clients, and you need to figure out how I'm going to structure these commercial terms, and whether any sort of data I'm dealing with, whether there's any data protection or privacy concerns. Usually people set up a separate privacy policy that takes into account their privacy obligations, and also, for example, any regulatory concerns overseas. A lot of privacy policies, and since the GDPR, have to comply with the EU GDPR provisions, especially if you have access to EU users. Any partner agreements you've signed, make sure that they're negotiated properly. Although if you're a startup and you're partnering with a big company, in most cases you're not going to be able to negotiate those terms. So you just want to make sure that you've at least looked at it and make sure that those are not too much one-sided. On the regulatory side, the key concern here is just make sure you understand who your regulator is. So, for example, if you're in the financial services industry, you may have one regulator, or you may have multiple regulators, or you might realize that you don't really have a direct regulator, but there's always the FTC with the Federal Trade Commission, and the federal agencies that are consumer protection type agencies. There's also the state, attorney generals and other regulators that regulate business as well. So you need to be aware of it, and at least know that your business model, first of all, obviously should be legal, but also it has to take into account any sort of regulatory rules that you have to comply with. Intellectual property, that falls into multiple areas, corporate, commercial, employment, all these areas. On the corporate side, make sure all founders, are are signing agreements to assign all intellectual property over to the company in exchange for stock. Anybody else who's worked on the product, let's say developers, contract developers, any development firm, that they actually sign a work for hire provision to assign all IP over to the company, so the company can maintain chain of title of the IP. This becomes, obviously it's always an issue, for example, in a financing, when an investor wants to do due diligence, and also if your company is being sold, a buyer wants to make sure that the company maintains chain of title of IP. Infringement and registration. Now, going back to the corporate side again, on day one, you should definitely do a trademark search just to make sure the name you're using is not infringing on anybody else's intellectual property. Trademark filings, some people, don't want to pay for it right away, but you could, if you had the money, you could do a trademark filing. But in any case, you should run a search. Make sure you're not infringing on anybody's intellectual property, not on the trademark side, but also copyright, which is code, for example, or any patents, if your idea is of the type that would be patentable. So you need to figure out what it is. Now, sometimes, intellectual property can be registered, and other times it's not registered, for example, in trade secret, or some other form of IP that is not going to protect it under traditional registration regimes. So, but if it is registrable, at least consider whether it should be registered and whether it's cost effective to register at that point. Employment, make sure that anybody you're using is in fact a contractor and not an employee. So there's a test that IRS uses in terms of control. Make sure that you don't have the type of control that would be deemed this person as an employee. I mean, misclassification of employees is a big issue, and you could face significant issues, both IRS and state regulators. So you need to make sure that you classify them properly. For example, even in the context of not IRS and tax or payroll tax, it would also, for example, unemployment insurance and worker compensation, things like that. Incentive plan. When you're doing your corporate formation, the first thing you'll need to do is do the stock capitalization. So you'll need to figure out, how much needs to be issued, and then in that you will make, let's say, a 15 to 20%. You don't have to do that; you can do less, but you need to make an allocation for this incentive plan. That is because it's very difficult to hire employees for startups, because they're already working somewhere else. So you'll have to give them something more than just cash. So you have to give cash and non-cash compensation. So this incentive plan allocation, you do it on day one, but then at some point in future you'll have to actually have a written incentive plan. And in that plan, you can, for example, authorize different, equity types. For example, the restricted stock, options, other types of equity. If you're hiring employees, then obviously that's a big undertaking that will trigger a lot of other obligations, payroll taxes, other obligations. So you need to worry about that. Finally, miscellaneous items, banking, make sure you choose the right bank. Accountants, make sure you get a DUNS number, which is essentially a business credit file that is made on day one. Leases, anywhere you're going to use as space, make sure that you've looked over the lease, make sure it's not too one-sided. IT systems and security goes back to what your obligations are to your customers, but also in the integrity of your own system. Tax, I should have put tax maybe, up there somewhere, but tax is always a concern. S-Corp usually don't, startups usually don't do S-Corp elections just because it limits your ability to raise money from foreign investors. It also limits your ability to raise money from entity investors. So it's probably going to be a C-Corp, but you'll need to still consider whether it's an owner-operated business versus a startup. Owner-operated business is, essentially where a person has to get up and they have to do work, and then they're expecting an income at the end of the month. Usually, in that case, you may, for example, be better off with a pass-through entity such as an LLC or an S-Corp. If you're selling products, you need to also worry about sales tax. So I just wanted to quickly give a quick wrap-up of the kind of key legal things that you need to worry about. If you need to learn more, you can always set up a call with me, and we can go over your individual situation and see what sort of things you will need as you get started.